Today I'm going to be speaking with Joe Henrich, who's professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University and also author of the book, The Weirdest People in the World: How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. It's really great having you on today. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, good to be with you.
So let's first talk about WEIRD is an acronym, WEIRD, for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. So how did you first start to sort of think about this group of people as a group of people and sort of what the defining characteristics are?
Yeah, so around 2006 or so, I began working with two cultural psychologists, Steve Heine and Arnor Zion, at the University of British Columbia. And, we had come together over lunch and stuff and began to talk about our research. And what we each had realized somewhat independently was not only was there cultural variation around the world in key aspects of psychology, but that the populations most commonly studied by psychologists and others were unusual when seated in that global perspective. So they were often at the tail end of the distribution or, distinctively set apart from other populations.
Hmm.
So we came up with the idea of writing a paper together, The Weirdest People in the World, meant to raise an alarm, kind of a methodological concern uh, aimed at psychologists and others, that they were overgeneralizing from the populations that they studied, that they couldn't make assumptions about human behavior by studying American undergraduates or people online, people from those sources. And then, as a way of referring to the populations most commonly studied by researchers, we came up with the acronym WEIRD. Just as a way, and it's meant as a consciousness raising device to kind of remind researchers that they should be cautious about generalizing.
So when we talk about the characteristics, Western makes sense, educated makes sense, industrialized, rich, and democratic. When we talk about rich, are we talking about rich at a global scale, or are we saying even within these Western countries, we're talking about the rich?
Well, I mean, what we had in mind was mostly psychologists were sampling undergrad at the time. They were mostly sampling undergraduates from a small handful of countries. So the U.S., Canada, a couple of places in Europe, Australia, places like that. So, to the degree to which American undergraduates tend to be disproportionately sampled from the middle and upper class, yeah. So in that case, it leaves out um, lower SES. And then, of course, globally, those are among the richest countries in the world.
Before we move on to some of the other aspects of your research, it's often repeated, and things that are often repeated aren't necessarily true, but it's often repeated that um, if you compare folks from the large cities in the United States to the rest of the US and then compare them to people from places like London and Paris, etc., that the folks from large cities across these countries are much more similar than those within the United States living in urban versus rural settings, for example. Do you think in your research, does that sound right to you, or does that maybe miss some important things?
Well, it definitely misses some important things. So, in putting together the evidence that we were able to gather, you can compare corporate managers or executives from around the world working at leading productive companies, and you can detect the same kind of psychological variation you can get if you compare the groups from lower socioeconomic status or more representative populations of these countries.
Can you talk a little bit about, in the title of the book, you use the term psychologically peculiar. Peculiar can just mean unique and different, but it can also mean that there's sort of something maybe that we would identify as strange or unusual. What are the psychological peculiarities of this group that is often the source for studies?
Yeah, so the key thing I wanted to focus on was trying to understand the psychological variation we find around across populations around the globe. So some of the key dimensions that emerged were one is a kind of psychological cluster or complex called individualism.
Hmm.
That's associated with how people think about themselves, about overconfidence and self-esteem, and the role of guilt versus shame. And so there's a whole cluster there where people in weird societies tend to think about themselves as unitary individual decision makers rather than nodes in a social network. They tend to be overconfident. They tend to have concerns about guilt, but shame is relatively unimportant. This goes along with another pattern, which is analytic versus holistic thinking. So there tends to be an inclination towards more analytic thinking, so breaking problems down into parts, assigning properties to those parts, and then reasoning from that point of view, as opposed to looking at the relationships among parts to make explanations. So we find lots of variation there. The use of intentionality and moral judgment seems to be another one. So lots of Westerners really think intentions are important, but in other places, intentions don't seem to be important at all, at least in making some moral judgments. Moral universalism, so the degree to which you think everyone should be judged by the same moral standards, versus moral particularism, where you make a difference between how people within some circle should be judged versus people outside that circle. Trust in strangers is another important one, things like that.
What are the sources of these peculiarities? I mean, is it media? Is it the characteristics themselves, like being, rich or industrialized or whatever the case may be? Does religion and or churches play a role? What causes this?
Well, I mean, there's probably lots of factors that affect overall global psychological variation. But in the book, I was particularly interested in trying to understand why it was that European and European descent populations became particularly individualistic and particularly have a strong impersonal prosociality. So this trust and cooperation with strangers, which should be contrasted with a more interpersonal prosociality, where people are much more cooperative and positively inclined towards people they know, people they have relationships with, that kind of thing within group loyalty. So the case that I make is that much of the kind of unusual nature of European society as it emerged in the last 500 years comes from a particular set of taboos and prescriptions that one branch of Christianity, the one that evolves into the Roman Catholic Church, began to promulgate in late antiquity, and eventually, although gradually, spreads throughout many parts of Western Europe and transforms the intensive, complex kinship organizations that you would find in many pre-Christian European societies, and breaks them down into monogamous nuclear families. And then this opens the door for other kinds of institutions, impersonal institutions, eventually things like democracy and Western law and whatnot. But initially things like guilds, universities, monasteries that were organized differently and built around notions of individuals trying to attract individuals. So it really puts these populations on a different kind of cultural evolutionary trajectory than we see in many societies around the world and back in history.
So, if I understand correctly, even though today in the United States, for example, Roman Catholics are not a majority, the evolution and growth of the Roman Catholic Church starting 500 years ago in Europe led to, in a sense, psychological changes which include acceptance of certain types of relationships to institutions that are still very relevant today in terms of how this group you study relates to the world.
That's right. You should think of that, the stuff the Catholic Church did, as initiating a kind of cultural evolutionary process. And then these principles get to varying degrees embedded in secular institutions and become part of the general cultural milieu. One of the cases I make in the book is that this process led to the emergence of Protestantism. So, there's this goes on for 1,000 years before Martin Luther and others initiate this Protestant Reformation, which of course is a constellation, a mosaic of different religious movements that are rebelling against the Catholic Church. But I mean, they have sort of super weird characteristics in the sense that they're really focused on mental states, the role of intentionality, centrality on the individual, emphasis on hard work, deferral of gratification. So it only further accentuates some of the basic characteristics that had been developing prior to that.
Some of the characteristics you write about and that you've spoken about, high level of individualism, maybe analytical to some degree in a way that's not as common in other societies or in other parts of society, nonconformism, et cetera. I will often hear from people when they visit a country that is outside of this group, friends who have done work in Southeast Asia or have gone to Africa, et cetera. And they seem to very quickly pick up on the fact that there's just sort of like something different about the perspective on the world around them that has to do with some of the traits that you're pointing out here. So it seems as though part of the reason many who are part of this weird group aren't aware of this is they're just around people like themselves all the time. In other words, we have the ability to notice when folks are different. We maybe just aren't spending enough time around them, but that once you do, you realize that there is some kind of cultural difference here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that's the real value to traveling and living in other societies. So, I come up as an anthropologist. So, as a cultural anthropologist, I got to live in Amazonia in small communities. I did a long stretch of field work in the South Pacific on remote islands, and really tried to dig in and live among the people. And to the degree to which other people did that for other reasons, it really does kind of, it's like a fish out of water or something. You really then begin to notice the lack of water around you, or the striking difference that you don't see unless unless you get removed from the water.
Is it hard to understand some of these things just by being told about them? Because what my mind is going to is, if you read some of Jared Diamond's books, for example, where he talks extensively about his time spent in the Pacific with the Maori people, etc., when you just read his descriptions of the culture, yes, it's different, but I can only imagine that the degree to which you can really feel that partially has to be from actually being there thousands of miles from where you normally are, and sort of being told about this phenomena can only really do so much.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways to get at it. So, of course, living with people and learning the language and trying to really engage in the society is the best way to get a feel for it.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there are, I guess not, things like novels can try to bring you and put you in the shoes of someone living in that society, an honor society where you're very concerned about maintaining your honor because that protects your family and it's core to your identity as a person. So that's another way. And then, of course, some amount of travel can at least give you a feel for it.
Are any of the distinctions that you study, can value judgments be assigned to them to some degree in terms of either what's, quote, better for the individuals within or for the groups and societies at a whole? Or is this merely we're observing differences and that's as far as it goes?
Well, so my mission in the book was just to, well, kind of start out by documenting the differences, but the thing I was really interested in doing is explaining the variation and cueing to my readers, many of which I sort of assumed as I wrote the book would be mostly weird. So I was trying to jar them in ways that would make them recognize the water, so to speak. So recognize the sort of psychological differences. So when I talk about analytic thinking, analytic thinking can be very powerful, breaking things down into parts and assigning them properties. It's really the basis of how, what physics is, right? Break everything down into particles and give them charges or spin or charge or something like that. And then explain everything from that. Psychologists give people personalities and try to explain that. Economists do a similar thing. So it's very powerful, but you can miss the forest. So like some of the subsections in the book are like missing the forest, reminding people that if you're too much of an analytic thinker, you can miss how all the parts fit together and how the relationships are so important. So for example, when psychologists do work on what leads to effective problem solving in teams, the best teams at solving problems and engaging in creativity are teams that have a mixture of analytic and holistic thinkers. So you need both groups. Towards the end of the book, I really emphasize the role of embracing cultural differences for generating innovation. So most innovations are recombinations of existing ideas. And so the degree to which you can get people with very different ideas, different ways of seeing the world, to interact in mutually trusting and potentially cooperative and beneficial ways, you're just going to generate more innovation. So one of the things I've been researching lately is the degree to which immigration energized economic growth and innovation patenting within the United States.
You talk in the book about delayed gratification and differences among different societies on delayed gratification. Many of us have probably heard of these studies that were done on little kids where they say, well, I'm going to put a cookie in front of you and I'm going to leave. And if you don't eat it, I'll give you a second cookie later. And you kind of evaluate, who does what. I think to some degree, in weird societies, as defined by you, being able to delay gratification is seen as objectively good. And that may not always be the case, but it seems as though it's seen as sort of like a virtue in some sense, being able to delay gratification. And one of the things you find is that not delaying gratification is more common among non-weird people. Is that a place where there's actually sort of like logical explanations for why it's not objectively better to delay gratification if you consider the context, maybe?
Yeah. So that's a great case because people do have a sense that that's sort of a virtue. That's very much a Protestant virtue, actually.
Mm.
So you get that right out of Protestantism. So the way to think about it is that these aspects of our psychology are adapted to the institutional and ecological environments that we have to confront. So Chris Blattman and colleagues, political scientists and economists, University of Chicago, did this research in Liberia, where they basically created a training course to try to increase the self-regulation of poor men, to try to make them more patient and more willing to defer gratification. The training worked, and they were able to show that on the psychological tests, men were willing to defer gratification more. And initially, this seemed to be a big success because the men were able to begin to develop little nest eggs of savings and things like that.
Right.
Okay, so that's working. But then it turns out that because the environment is so unstable, the men would get robbed or they'd get shaken down by the police or something would happen and they'd lose their complete nest egg. So they wouldn't get the pleasure that would have come from indulging in that. So that's one way, and you need a stable environment where you can preserve that savings, and you need the chance that you're going to be alive when you get a chance to take advantage of it. Otherwise, it's better to consume now when you're sure you're going to get something out of it. The other thing that varies across societies is in a lot of cases, if I accumulate much, my relatives are going to come and ask for it, essentially. So someone will die, there'll be a funeral, or there'll be a wedding. So what I do, one way to deal with any kind of rising surplus is just to give it away, have a party or give it to others. And the way people think about that, or maybe not consciously, but the way it ends up functioning, is that you're storing your surplus in the goodwill and relationships you have with others.
Right.
So when you're in need, you don't have to have a nest egg. Your nest egg is scattered amongst all these friends and relatives and close contacts that you've cultivated over long periods of time.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And to some degree, I've studied that a little bit in Hasidic Jewish communities. And that phenomena is very, very notable there, interestingly enough. The book is fascinating. It's called The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. We've been speaking with the book's author, Harvard University professor Joe Henrich. Joe, really appreciate your time today.
Okay, well, it's great to be with you.